Think of the most magical voice you have ever heard, a voice that could make you believe in rainbows and home and the promise that your troubles would melt like lemon drops. That was Judy Garland. She wasn't just a singer or an actress. She was a feeling, a spark of pure, unadulterated joy that defined an era of American cinema. But behind the glittering facade of Oz, behind the ruby slippers and the yellow brick road, there was another story playing out, a much darker and more cruel narrative written not by a wizard, but by the cold, calculating machinery of the Hollywood studio system. This is the story of how the Dream Factory, in its relentless pursuit of profit and perfection, systematically dismantled its most valuable asset, creating a tragedy that would haunt the industry for generations. We often see these old Hollywood legends as distant, glamorous figures, but Judy Garland's life was a raw, human experience of immense pressure, profound loneliness, and a desperate search for acceptance in a world that only valued her for what she could produce. It's a story that begins with breathtaking talent and descends into a vortex of controlled substances, psychological manipulation, and heartbreaking betrayal, all before she had even turned 18. The very institution that promised to make her a star was, from almost the very beginning, methodically breaking her down. This isn't just a tale of a bygone era. It's a shockingly relevant cautionary tale about the cost of fame, the abuse of power, and the fragility of the human spirit in the face of insatiable corporate demand. We're going to pull back the velvet curtain on one of Hollywood's most guarded secrets, tracing the path from a young girl named Frances Gumm to the global icon known as Judy Garland, and finally, to the tragic figure whose light was extinguished far too soon. We will uncover the calculated decisions, the pills that were handed out like candy, and the relentless pressure that transformed a vibrant talent into a commodity to be used and discarded. This journey will take us deep into the gilded cage of the studio lot, where the price of stardom was a soul, and the contract was signed in blood, sweat, and tears. So settle in as we explore the immense talent, the devastating pills, the unbearable pressure, and the profound heartbreak that together form the Judy Garland tragedy, a story that continues to echo through the halls of fame and reminds us of the very real human cost behind the silver screen magic. Long before there was a Judy Garland, there was a little girl named Frances Gumm, born into the smoky, unpredictable world of vaudeville. From her very first breaths in 1922, performance was her inheritance. Her parents were theater people, and the stage was not just a workplace, but a second home. Even as a toddler, little Frances, whom her family called Baby, displayed a vocal power that was startlingly out of proportion to her small frame. It wasn't just that she could carry a tune. She possessed a rare emotional depth, an ability to connect with a lyric that suggested a lifetime of experience she simply hadn't lived yet. This raw, natural talent was immediately recognized by her mother, Ethel Gumm, a woman whose own theatrical ambitions had been thwarted and who was determined to see her daughters, particularly the youngest, Frances, achieve the stardom she never could. Ethel became the quintessential stage mother, a formidable and often terrifying force. Rehearsals were grueling, and perfection was the only acceptable standard. For Frances, singing and dancing weren't just childhood play. They were a serious business, a demanding job instilled in her from the time she could walk. The family act, the Gum Sisters, trod the boards of theaters across the country, but it was clear to everyone who saw them that baby Frances was the real star, the one with that indescribable it factor. The trajectory of her life changed forever during a performance at the famed Oriental Theater in Chicago. The story goes that the theater's owner, George Jessel, suggested the name Garland was more appealing than Gum, and so, with a new surname, Judy Garland was born. It was during this engagement that a powerful figure from Metro-Goldwyn, Mayer, was in the audience. He wasn't just impressed, he was astounded. He sent a now famous telegram back to the studio heads in Hollywood that simply read, "Have found a youngster with a terrific voice. She is a plump little girl, but very photogenic and sings like a star." That plump little girl was just 13 years old. Shortly after, Louis B. Mayer, the formidable head of MGM, signed her to a standard studio contract. In that moment, the fate of Frances Gum was sealed. She was no longer just a talented child from a vaudeville family. She was now the property of the greatest dream factory the world had ever known, setting her on a path that would demand everything she had and more. A path that began with unimaginable promise, but was paved from the very start with profound pressures that no child should ever have to bear. And so, at the tender age of 13, Judy Garland was delivered into the heart of a behemoth. Metro-Goldwyn, Mayer in the 1930s and 40s, was not merely a movie studio. It was a self-contained empire, a city within a city, operating with the regimented precision of an industrial assembly line. But instead of manufacturing cars or appliances, its product was fantasy, and its most valuable raw material was human talent. At the helm was Louis B. Mayer, a man who ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of paternalistic concern. He famously referred to his contract players as his children, fostering an atmosphere of a large, extended family. Yet this was a family with strictly enforced rules and devastating consequences for disobedience. The studio system was designed for total control. From the moment a young performer signed the standard 7-year contract, they ceased to belong to themselves. MGM managed everything. They assigned roles, designed wardrobes, crafted publicity, and meticulously orchestrated every public appearance. For a young starlet like Judy, this control extended far beyond the soundstage. The studio's publicity department manufactured a wholesome, girl next door persona for her, a stark contrast to the sophisticated glamour of actresses like Lana Turner. They dictated who she could be seen with in public, often arranging dates with other young contract players to generate harmless press and quash any rumors that might tarnish her carefully constructed image. But the most invasive control was often exercised over the actors' physical bodies. Judy, as noted in that initial telegram, was not the waif-like ideal the studio typically favored. Almost immediately, she was put on a relentless series of strict diets. Studio executives would openly criticize her weight, calling her "my little hunchback" because of the way she would slouch when she was self-conscious about her body. She was given amphetamines to suppress her appetite and keep her energy levels high enough to endure 16-hour workdays. Then, at the end of the day, to counteract the speed and allow her to sleep, she was given barbiturates. This cycle of uppers and downers was not some clandestine activity. It was a standard practice sanctioned by the studio doctors themselves. The pills were handed out casually, like vitamins, a necessary tool to keep the machinery of stardom running smoothly. Even her smile was not her own. Unhappy with her teeth, the studio arranged for a cap to be placed on one of them, a small but symbolic alteration that signaled she was being remade, piece by piece, into the product MGM required. This gilded cage, for all its splendor and promise, was a place of constant scrutiny and immense psychological pressure. The message was clear and repeated daily. The real Judy, Frances Gumm, was not good enough. She had to be thinner, more graceful, more disciplined, more everything. Her inherent, extraordinary talent was accepted, but her very being required a complete overhaul. The factory demanded a perfect specimen, and it would stop at nothing to create one, even if the process meant systematically dismantling the spirit of the young girl at its center. It was against this backdrop of relentless control and chemical dependency that Judy Garland was handed the role that would define her for all time. At just 16 years old, she was cast as Dorothy Gale in The Wizard of Oz, a part that would catapult her to international fame, but would also become a crucible, intensifying every single pressure the studio system had already placed upon her. While the finished film presents a magical, technicolor fantasy, the reality of its production was a grueling, almost torturous 6-month ordeal for its young star. The schedule was merciless, demanding 16, sometimes even 20-hour workdays. Judy was required to report to the makeup department at 4 or 5 in the morning, a process that itself took several hours. The application of her makeup was harsh on her skin, but it was the costume that became a particular source of agony. The famous blue gingham pinafore was, in fact, a corset, tightly laced to create a more slender, childlike silhouette, making it difficult to breathe and eat comfortably throughout the interminable filming days. This physical discomfort was compounded by the immense weight of expectation. The studio had invested a colossal sum in the production, and much of its success was perceived to rest squarely on Judy's small shoulders. Every take of Over the Rainbow, the song that would become her anthem, had to be perfect. The legend goes that studio executives initially wanted to cut the song, deeming it too slow and sentimental for a children's film. It was only through the fierce advocacy of the producers that it remained, a decision that would ultimately gift the world one of the most beloved recordings in history. But for Judy, the constant threat of the song being removed was just another layer of anxiety, another reminder that her best might not be good enough. The pressure manifested in very real ways. The demanding choreography, combined with the restrictive costume and the amphetamines she was taking to keep pace, led to severe physical reactions. She suffered from debilitating headaches and chronic exhaustion. Her youth and innate professionalism saw her through, but the cracks were beginning to show. The very set of Oz, with its bright colors and whimsical characters, became a prison of performance. The yellow brick road was not a path to adventure, but a track she was forced to walk again and again under the blistering heat of the studio lights. The friendship she portrayed with the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion was genuine, offering small respites of real human connection. But these were fleeting moments in an otherwise industrial process. By the time filming wrapped, the role of Dorothy was permanently etched into the cultural consciousness, and Judy Garland was a superstar. Yet, the experience had exacted a terrible toll. The film that made her a household name had also reinforced the studio's most destructive habits. The pills that got her through the day and helped her sleep at night were now an unquestioned necessity. The Wizard of Oz was her blessing, the source of her enduring legacy, but it was also her curse, solidifying the brutal working conditions and pharmaceutical reliance that would shadow her for the rest of her life. She had given the world a timeless symbol of hope and home, all while being systematically separated from her own sense of safety and belonging. This chemical management of Judy's body and mind was not a secret, backroom operation. It was an open, clinical procedure administered by the very people entrusted with her health. The studio system's solution to the impossible demands it placed on a child was pharmacology. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to picture the MGM studio doctor not as a villain in a dark cloak, but as a friendly, authoritative figure who would visit the set with his little black bag. When Judy, exhausted from a pre-dawn wake-up call and hours of schoolwork, before even reaching the soundstage, began to flag, the solution was straightforward. A so-called pep pill would be offered. These were almost certainly amphetamines, powerful central nervous system stimulants that would wipe away fatigue, suppress appetite, and create a surge of artificial energy and focus. For the studio, this was brilliant, efficient management. Their young star could now power through a grueling 14-hour day of singing, dancing, and acting with a seemingly endless smile. The relentless dieting pressure was simultaneously alleviated as the drugs naturally curbed her hunger. It was a win-win for the executives, who saw only the output, a perfectly energetic, slender, and compliant performer. But the human body is not a machine that can run indefinitely on overdrive. After a day fueled by speed, Judy's nervous system would be buzzing, her mind racing, making sleep an impossibility. So the same doctor who provided the up would return at the end of the marathon day to provide the down. A barbiturate, a powerful sedative, would be administered to forcibly shut down the system he had artificially accelerated just hours before. This created a vicious, inescapable cycle. Uppers to work, downers to rest, a chemical seesaw that replaced the natural rhythms of childhood. By the time she was a teenager, Judy Garland was already physically and psychologically dependent on these substances. The most chilling aspect is how normalized this was. The pills were presented as a necessary tool of the trade, no different than a costume or a sheet of music. They were casually handed out by assistants, approved by mothers, and sanctioned by the corporate structure. There was no informed consent, no discussion of long-term addiction risks or the profound impact on a developing brain. For a young girl who had been taught from infancy to obey authority, particularly the authority of the studio that was her entire world, refusing was unthinkable. This studio-sanctioned addiction fundamentally rewired her relationship with her own body and emotions. She never learned natural coping mechanisms for stress, fatigue, or anxiety. Instead, she learned that any discomfort, any human feeling of weariness or sadness, could be chemically erased. This dependency became the central tragedy of her life, a trap sprung by her employers before she was even old enough to drive, ensuring that the brightest star in their constellation would forever be chained to the very system that claimed to celebrate her light. While her peers were navigating the awkward hallways of high school, experiencing first dates and school dances, Judy Garland's entire world was confined to the 44 sound stages of the MGM lot. Her adolescence was not a time of self-discovery, but of constant, unyielding refinement under a microscope. The studio functioned as her school, her workplace, and her prison, a bizarre ecosystem where childhood milestones were replaced by professional obligations. She had studio-appointed tutors who educated her between takes, but a genuine education about life, relationships, and oneself was impossible to acquire in such an artificial environment. Her classmates weren't other teenagers, but established, often cynical, adult stars. She formed bonds with figures like Mickey-Rooney, but these relationships were invariably framed by the studio's publicity machine, part of a series of profitable musicals rather than organic friendships. The profound loneliness she experienced was a defining feature of these years. Imagine being constantly surrounded by hundreds of people, directors, costume designers, makeup artists, producers, yet feeling utterly invisible. These individuals were not there for Francis Gum. They were there to service Judy Garland, the product. Every interaction was transactional, every conversation ultimately about the work. There was no one in whom she could confide her fears or insecurities, because expressing doubt was seen as a sign of weakness, or worse, ingratitude. Her mother, Ethel, who might have been a source of comfort, was instead a co-architect of this pressure, fiercely ambitious and deeply invested in her daughter's financial success. The message was reinforced daily. Your value is your talent, your output, your obedience. The most relentless form of scrutiny was reserved for her body. As she transitioned from a girl to a young woman, the studio's anxiety over her appearance intensified. She was subjected to weekly, sometimes daily, weigh-ins that were conducted with the grim seriousness of a military inspection. Studio executives, including Louis B. Mayer himself, would openly humiliate her, calling her fat or my little piggy if the scale showed a number they disliked. This public shaming over a few pounds created a lifelong torment of body dysmorphia. She was simultaneously praised for her mature, womanly voice and condemned for her natural, womanly body. To ensure she remained the girl next door, the studio would often use physical tricks to downplay her development, like binding her chest with gauze to maintain a more juvenile silhouette on camera. This constant assault on her physical self fundamentally eroded any chance of developing a healthy self-image. How could she possibly feel confident or beautiful when the most powerful men in her world consistently told her she was flawed? The very essence of teenage identity formation, figuring out who you are, was denied to her. She was never allowed to simply be. She was always being molded, criticized, and adjusted. The vibrant, confident young woman she might have become was systematically suppressed, replaced by a profoundly insecure performer who, despite hearing the applause of millions, lived in constant fear that she would be found inadequate and cast aside. The studio had not just hired an actress. It had taken custody of a child, and in the process, it stole her adolescence, replacing the normal struggles of growing up with a corporate-mandated ordeal that left deep, permanent scars on her psyche. The meticulously constructed machine of Judy Garland's career, running for years on a volatile mix of raw talent and pharmaceutical fuel, could not hold together forever. The first visible signs of fracture began to appear not in private, but in the very public, high-pressure environment of the film set. The behavior that the studio had once managed behind closed doors started to spill over into production, signaling a profound internal collapse. The most frequent and telling symptom was her increasing and now legendary lateness. What the studio executives dismissed as simple unprofessionalism or a star's tantrum was, in reality, the manifestation of paralyzing anxiety and the physical fallout of her drug dependency. Imagine the sheer terror of waking up after a night forced upon you by barbiturates, your body heavy as lead, your mind fogged, knowing you are expected to be vibrant, charming, and perfect for the cameras in just a few hours. The simple act of getting out of bed became a Herculean task. The pep pills that were supposed to solve this problem now contributed to it, creating a cycle where the crash from one day's uppers made the next morning's awakening even more impossible. This wasn't laziness. It was a cry for help from a system pushed to its absolute breaking point. These delays were met not with compassion or concern, but with cold, corporate punishment. MGM began to suspend her. At first glance, a suspension might seem like a paid vacation, but in the studio system, it was a devastating weapon. Each suspension was a public humiliation, reported gleefully by the press, which painted Judy as difficult, unreliable, and ungrateful. More insidiously, the clock on her ironclad 7-year contract would stop during a suspension. This meant the end date of her contractual servitude to MGM was pushed further and further into the future. She was not being given time to recover. She was being given more time to serve. This tactic transformed a supposed disciplinary measure into a form of indentured servitude, deepening her sense of being trapped. The studio that had created the conditions for her breakdown was now punishing her for showing the symptoms. The pressure cooker finally exploded during the production of The Barclays of Broadway in 1948. Partnered once again with Fred Astaire, a project that should have been a comfortable return to form became a nightmare. The combination of her inner turmoil, the chemical imbalances in her body, and the unrelenting pressure to perform led to a complete physical and emotional shutdown. She was frequently unable to report to the set at all. When she did arrive, hours late, she was often in no state to work. The studio doctor was summoned more frequently, but his solutions were the same pills that had caused the problem in the first place. The situation became untenable, and MGM made the unprecedented decision to replace her with Ginger Rogers just 2 weeks into filming. This was not a quiet reassignment. It was a very public firing, a seismic event in Hollywood that signaled to the world that Judy Garland was, in the studio's eyes, broken goods. The facade of the happy MGM family was shattered. This public collapse was followed by an even more traumatic event during the filming of Annie, Get Your Gun. Initially thrilled by the prestigious role, Judy quickly found herself buckling under the weight of it. The director, Busby Berkeley, was known for his perfectionism and demanding style, which clashed horribly with her fragile state. The old patterns of lateness and anxiety returned with a vengeance. The studio, losing patience and money, took the drastic step of shutting down the entire production and suspending her. The message was clear. Her instability was so profound that it could halt a multi-million-dollar enterprise. In a final, cruel blow, she was eventually replaced by Betty Hutton. Being fired once was a humiliation. Being fired from a second major production in as many years was a career-ending catastrophe in the eyes of the industry. These very public meltdowns and suspensions were not the cause of her troubles, but the inevitable result. They were the cracks in the dam, the visible evidence of a spirit that had been strained to its absolute limit by the very system that now cast her out for showing the damage it had inflicted. Yet this very public professional unraveling was only one facet of the tragedy. The deep and lasting damage inflicted by the studio system seeped into every corner of her private world, making the formation of a stable, happy personal life nearly impossible. You have to understand that Judy Garland entered adulthood having never experienced a normal relationship. Her entire frame of reference for love and connection was filtered through the transactional, performance-based environment of Hollywood. At just 19 years old, and while still deeply entangled in the studio's web of control, she fell for David Rose, a talented composer and arranger more than a decade her senior, who was already established in the industry. Their whirlwind romance felt like an escape, a chance to finally have something that was truly her own. But MGM, which still viewed her as its property, was horrified. Louis B. Mayer and the studio executives saw marriage as a threat to the carefully crafted girl next door image they had spent years building. They pressured her relentlessly, arguing that getting married would ruin her career. When she defiantly went ahead and married Rose in 1941, the studio's retaliation was swift and cruel. She was effectively sidelined, offered fewer roles and less prestigious projects as a punishment for her disobedience. The message was unmistakable. Your personal happiness is secondary to your value as a commodity. Almost immediately, another immense pressure was applied. The studio and her own mother, Ethel, began pressuring the young couple to have a child. This was not born from a place of warmth for family life, but from a cold, calculated publicity angle. A baby would rehabilitate Judy's image, making her seem more mature and wholesome, thus appeasing her fan base. The emotional toll of this demand on a young woman who is still essentially a child herself, grappling with addiction and the trauma of her upbringing, is almost unimaginable. The marriage, built on a fragile foundation and crushed by external pressures, quickly disintegrated. They divorced after less than 3 years, a stark lesson that even in her most intimate choices, Judy was not truly free. Her role as a mother began under similarly strained circumstances. When she gave birth to her daughter, Liza Minnelli, with her second husband, director Vincent Minnelli, the studio's publicity machine went into overdrive, presenting a picture of domestic bliss. But behind the scenes, Judy's life was a chaos of pill dependency and emotional instability. There were moments of genuine, fierce love for Liza, but her ability to provide consistent, nurturing motherhood was severely compromised by the very cycles that defined her existence. There are heartbreaking accounts of young Liza sometimes having to care for her mother, putting her to bed when she was overcome by the effects of the sedatives. The child learned to navigate the unpredictable terrain of her mother's moods, the highs of frantic energy and the lows of deep despair. Judy's intense love for her children was never in question, but her capacity to be present was fractured by the demons Hollywood had unleashed. Her subsequent marriages, 5 in total, became a painful pattern of searching for a stability and salvation that always remained just out of reach. Each relationship began with hopeful, passionate intensity, a belief that this man would be the one to fix her, to finally make her feel safe and loved. But the unresolved trauma, the chemical dependencies, and the relentless pressure of her career would inevitably create fissures that widened into chasms. Her partners, no matter how well-intentioned, were ultimately unequipped to handle the profound turmoil within her. Her personal life became a mirror of her professional one, a series of intense, brilliant performances that were ultimately unsustainable, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and a profound loneliness that not even the love of her children or the adoration of millions could ever truly fill. The final, definitive break with the studio that had been her entire world since childhood came not with a single dramatic event, but through a slow, agonizing erosion of trust and viability. The suspension from Annie, Get Your Gun was the critical turning point, a public declaration of a relationship broken beyond repair. After being replaced by Betty Hutton, Judy was, in a sense, in limbo. The studio had invested millions in her over nearly 15 years, and simply cutting her loose was a significant financial decision. There was a period of uneasy truce, an attempt at reconciliation that was more about corporate pragmatism than genuine faith in her recovery. MGM still had a contract to fulfill, and they needed to find a project that could somehow rehabilitate their troubled star while minimizing the immense financial risk she now represented. The vehicle chosen was Royal Wedding, a charming musical starring Fred Astaire. It was seen as a safe bet, a familiar genre, a reliable co-star, and a role that didn't demand the immense, carrying the whole film pressure of an Annie, Get Your Gun. For a brief moment, it seemed like a path forward. Judy began work, but the underlying issues had not been resolved. The same patterns of debilitating anxiety, the chemical dependency that had become her primary coping mechanism, and the sheer physical exhaustion from years of abuse resurfaced almost immediately. The pressure to prove herself, to not fail again, was overwhelming. Reports from the set describe her as visibly fragile, struggling to meet the demands of the schedule. Once again, the lateness began. Once again, the studio doctors were summoned. And once again, the solution offered was the same cocktail of uppers and downers that had created the problem. It became painfully clear to the producers that the Judy Garland of old, the reliable workhorse who could power through any challenge, was gone. The machinery was broken, and their standard fixes were no longer working. The studio made the calculation that proceeding was a greater risk than stopping. For the third time in 2 years, Judy Garland was removed from a major film. This time, however, there would be no comeback within the gates of MGM. The suspension from Royal Wedding was the last straw. In 1950, after a series of tense meetings and legal negotiations, her contract was terminated by mutual consent. The phrase mutual consent papers over the brutal reality. She was fired. The Dream Factory, having extracted every ounce of talent and vitality from its biggest star, now found her too damaged to be of use. The finality of this break cannot be overstated. MGM was not just her employer. It was her home, her school, her family, however dysfunctional. It had defined her entire adult life and most of her childhood. To be cast out was a profound emotional cataclysm, a rejection that confirmed her deepest fears of being fundamentally inadequate and unwanted. The security of the studio system, for all its horrors, was the only security she had ever known. Now, at just 28 years old, she was alone in the world, a free agent for the first time, but carrying with her the scars of a lifetime of institutionalized abuse and an addiction that would dictate the turbulent chapters yet to come. Cast out from the only home she had ever known, Judy Garland found herself in a terrifying and unfamiliar state: freedom. The years immediately following her departure from MGM were a wilderness of personal and professional uncertainty. The industry that had once worshipped her now viewed her as a liability, a damaged goods story too risky to insure. But within this apparent exile, a remarkable transformation began to take place. Freed from the soul-crushing control of the studio system, Judy started the arduous work of reclaiming her own artistry. She turned to the one venue where she could have complete command: the concert stage. It was here, in a live setting, without a director to yell, cut, or a studio head to criticize her weight, that the raw power of her connection with an audience could fully ignite. Her legendary run at the London Palladium in 1951, followed by a record-breaking 19-week engagement at the Palace Theater on Broadway, were nothing short of a resurrection. Night after night, she proved that the magic was not a product of MGM's makeup department. It was an elemental force within her. These were not merely concerts. They were emotional spectacles, electrifying events where Judy, feeding off the palpable love of the crowd, would pour every ounce of her joy, her pain, and her hard-won resilience into the music. She was no longer playing a part written for her by someone else. She was simply, powerfully being herself. This triumphant comeback on stage sent a clear signal to Hollywood. Judy Garland was not finished. In fact, she was just beginning. The ultimate validation came in the form of a project that seemed to mirror her own life with an almost painful symmetry. A new, lavish production of A Star is Born. The story of an aging star on the decline who helps a young talent rise to fame, only to be eclipsed by her success, was Hollywood myth-making at its most meta. For Judy, the role of Esther Blodgett, the unknown singer who becomes movie star Vicki Lester, was more than a part. It was her story, her chance to tell the world what she had endured and what she had overcome. The film's director, George Cukor, famously known for working with actresses, saw past the gossip and the baggage to the profound artist she had become. He fought for her, believing she was the only one who could bring the necessary depth and authenticity to the role. The production at Warner Bros. Was a stark contrast to her MGM days. She was treated as a collaborator, an equal, her opinions valued and her instincts trusted. The result was a performance of staggering vulnerability and power. In the film's most iconic scene, a 13-minute musical number called The Man That Got Away, filmed in a single, breathtaking take, Judy doesn't just sing a song, she bleeds it. Every note is infused with the heartbreak of her failed marriages, the exhaustion of her struggles, and the defiant hope of her survival. It is arguably the greatest performance of her career, a raw nerve exposed on celluloid. When the film premiered in 1954, the critical reception was ecstatic. The world had its Judy back, but this was a new Judy, a deeper, more resonant artist. All the trade papers, all the insiders, declared it a certainty. The Oscar for Best Actress was hers. It was seen not just as an award for a single performance, but as a long overdue apology from an industry that had wronged her, a coronation of her incredible comeback. The night of the 27th Academy Awards ceremony should have been the culmination of her entire journey, a moment of sweet, poetic justice. Dressed in a beautiful gown, Judy was radiant, the picture of a victor returning from the battle. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, but as the evening dragged on, a sense of unease began to creep in. The category for Best Actress was being saved for last, a testament to the drama surrounding it. When the presenter, actor William Holden, finally stepped to the microphone, the entire room held its breath. He opened the envelope, paused, and then uttered a name that sent a shockwave through the theater: Grace Kelly. For the country girl, in an instant, the air went out of the room. The cameras, which had been eagerly trained on Judy to capture her moment of triumph, now swiveled away in a mixture of embarrassment and haste. The win for Grace Kelly, a talented but far less seasoned actress in a relatively subdued role, was seen by many not as a simple award for merit, but as a deliberate, cruel snub. The narrative quickly solidified. The old guard of Hollywood, the very system that had discarded Judy, could not bring itself to officially validate her rebirth on its own prestigious stage. The insult was compounded by the humiliating way the ceremony was handled. As Grace Kelly made her way to the podium, the show's director, desperate to stay on schedule, reportedly barked at a stunned Judy Garland. "Go up there and give her a kiss." Hurry up. In a moment that should have been hers, she was reduced to a prop, forced to publicly congratulate her successor. The psychological impact of this loss was catastrophic. For someone whose entire life had been a quest for approval, for that ultimate stamp of "you are good enough," the Oscar snub was not just a disappointment. It was a profound rejection that validated her deepest insecurities. It whispered the old, toxic message from Louis B. Mayer, you are flawed. You are not one of us. You will never be enough. The triumph of a star is born was instantly overshadowed by the agony of this very public defeat, a devastating blow that would send her on a downward spiral, making the next chapter of her life a desperate battle against the demons this betrayal had reawakened. The Oscar loss was a profound wound, but it could not extinguish the one thing the studio system never truly owned: her voice. In the years that followed that devastating night, Judy Garland embarked on what can only be described as a nomadic conquest of the world's stages. If Hollywood had rejected her, her global audience was ready to anoint her as their queen. This era became the great paradox of her life, a time of unparalleled artistic triumph, built upon a foundation of ever-increasing personal fragility. Liberated from the rigid confines of the film set, she discovered that the most powerful medium for her talent was the raw, unfiltered space of a live concert hall. Here, there were no second takes, no studio doctors waiting with pills to adjust a performance. It was just Judy and the people who loved her, and in that electric space, she forged a connection so intense it became the stuff of legend. The pinnacle of this period, the event that cemented her status not merely as a star, but as a cultural force, was her performance at Carnegie Hall on the night of April 23, 1961. The venue itself was symbolic. This was not a Hollywood soundstage. It was the most revered temple of high art in America. For a girl who had been told she was not the right shape, not the right type, not enough of a classical beauty, to headline Carnegie Hall was a defiant act of validation. The demand for tickets was so overwhelming that it broke the hall's 50-year record. The air inside was thick with a sense of historic occasion, a collective understanding that they were about to witness something transcendent. And from the moment she walked onto that stage, a small, vibrant figure in a sequined pantsuit, she commanded the room not with grandeur, but with an almost vulnerable intimacy. The set list was a journey through her entire life. She sang the songs that made her famous: Over the Rainbow, the Trolley Song, Get Happy, but she infused them with a depth of feeling that only decades of heartache and resilience could provide. This was not a mere recitation of hits. It was a soul-bearing autobiography in song. Her voice, which critics sometimes said had lost its girlish purity, had gained something far more compelling: a gritty, emotional honesty that could swing from a playful whisper to a roof-shaking belt in a single phrase. She joked with the audience, told stories, and fed off their adoration, creating a feedback loop of energy that built throughout the night. The performance was a marathon, stretching over 2 hours, and she gave every ounce of herself to it. The resulting live album, Judy at Carnegie Hall, captured this magic perfectly. It wasn't just a recording. It was a document of a perfect storm of artist, audience, and moment. It won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year, making her the first woman to receive that honor. In that triumph, she achieved a level of critical and commercial success that even MGM at its peak could never have manufactured. It was her ultimate victory, proof that her artistry was indestructible. Yet, this zenith of control came with a terrifying cost. The very intensity that made her concerts so legendary was also unsustainable. The pressure to deliver that level of emotional catharsis night after night was immense. Each performance was a massive expenditure of spiritual and physical energy. To prepare, the old cycles of medication often resurfaced. The anxiety before a show could be paralyzing, sometimes requiring something to calm her nerves. Then, to summon the superhuman energy needed to command a stadium of thousands, she might need a boost. And after the show, crashing from the adrenaline high and the artificial stimulants, sleep would be impossible without chemical assistance. The concert years, for all their glory, locked her into a new, equally grueling version of the old studio rhythm. The applause was thunderous, but the silence that followed in her hotel room was deafening. She was now the master of her own destiny, but the tools she had been given to manage that destiny were the same ones that had been poisoning her since childhood. She was giving the performances of her life, but she was slowly, inevitably, burning the candle at both ends to illuminate the world. Emboldened by her historic Carnegie Hall triumph, Judy Garland now set her sights on conquering the final frontier of American entertainment: television. In 1963, she signed an unprecedented deal with CBS for her own weekly variety show, a venture that promised to bring her electrifying stage presence directly into the living rooms of millions every Sunday night. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect match. Television was the dominant medium, and Judy was a performer who thrived on live, immediate connection. The network, recognizing her star power, gave her an extraordinary amount of creative control and a then staggering sum of money, making her one of the highest paid performers on television. The stage was set for a glorious new chapter, a weekly celebration of her talent that would solidify her legacy for a new generation. But this ambitious venture would soon expose the fundamental, irreconcilable conflict at the heart of her career. The chasm between her spontaneous, emotionally driven artistry and the rigid, unforgiving demands of a weekly television schedule. This was not the loose, free-form environment of a concert tour. This was an industrial production line that demanded absolute reliability. The pressure was immense from the very beginning. Each one-hour episode was a monumental undertaking, requiring Judy to learn multiple musical numbers, complex choreography, and comedic sketches with guest stars, all while battling a level of stage fright that had only intensified over the years. The familiar, destructive patterns from her MGM days resurfaced with a vengeance. The terror of not being perfect, of failing in front of an audience of tens of millions, could be paralyzing. The relentless weekly deadline was a far cry from the flexible schedule of concert dates, where a bad night could be followed by a day of rest. Here, there were no days off. If an episode finished filming at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, the writers and producers were already in a meeting a few hours later to start planning the next show. The chemical crutch that had been a part of her life since adolescence became more essential than ever. A desperate attempt to manage the overwhelming anxiety and physical exhaustion. She would sometimes need medication to calm her nerves enough to even leave her dressing room, and then other substances to provide the burst of energy required for a flawless performance under the hot lights. The very system designed to showcase her genius was, once again, exacerbating the vulnerabilities that threatened to undo it. Her unreliability became the show's defining narrative behind the scenes. Episodes would be thrown into chaos by her failure to appear for rehearsals or her inability to remember lines. There were times when the crew and guest stars would wait for hours, the tension in the studio palpable, unsure if she would show up at all. When she did arrive, she could be a whirlwind of professional perfection, nailing a number in a single take with that unmistakable Garland magic. But these moments of brilliance were increasingly punctuated by stretches of incapacitating fear and disorientation. The network executives who had invested a fortune in the show watched with growing alarm. Ratings started strong, fueled by massive public curiosity, but began to slide as the production's instability became a topic of industry gossip. The public saw a glamorous, sometimes nervous, but always compelling performer. The people working on the show witnessed a human being in the throes of a daily battle for survival. The end came not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet corporate decision. After 26 episodes, CBS canceled the Judy Garland show. The official reason cited was low ratings, but everyone involved knew the truth. The star at the center of the multimillion-dollar enterprise was too unpredictable to sustain the grueling pace. For Judy, the cancellation was more than just a professional setback. It was a devastating financial blow and a profound personal humiliation. She had invested not just her name, but her own money into the venture, and the failure left her in a precarious financial state. More painfully, it felt like a public reaffirmation of the same old story. Just as MGM had discarded her when she became too difficult television, the new Hollywood had now done the same. The dream of a stable, controlled environment where she could be the master of her own domain had shattered, leaving her more exposed and vulnerable than ever. The television experiment was supposed to be her redemption in the modern media landscape. Instead, it became one of the most public and painful failures of her life, a stark reminder that the demons born in the studio system's gilded cage were still very much in control. Yet even as she achieved her greatest artistic freedom, a different, more relentless form of pressure was closing in, one that no amount of talent or charisma could charm away. The financial foundation of Judy Garland's life was, from the very beginning, built on sand. Despite earning what would be tens of millions in today's dollars over her career, she was perpetually on the brink of financial ruin, hounded by the Internal Revenue Service in a saga of debt and desperation that became a central horror of her later years. The roots of this catastrophe were planted deep in her childhood. At MGM, she was a salaried employee. While the studio made fortunes from her films, she received a weekly paycheck, and much of her substantial earnings were controlled by the studio and notoriously by her mother, Ethel. The concept of financial management was never taught to her. Money was simply something that appeared and was then spent by the adults around her. This pattern of dependency and financial illiteracy continued into her adult life. She was a star who lived like a star, with extravagant tastes and a generous heart. But she was surrounded by a rotating cast of managers, husbands, and advisors who often proved to be incompetent or, worse, outright predatory. They lived off her income, made poor investments, and failed to set aside money for taxes, the most basic and critical of financial responsibilities. The result was that Judy, the engine of this entire economy, was often the last to know how dire the situation had become. The first major crisis erupted in the early 1950s, shortly after her departure from MGM. The IRS slapped her with a massive bill for back taxes, a sum that eclipsed $500,000, a staggering amount at the time. This wasn't a matter of refusing to pay. It was a shocking revelation that the money had never been set aside in the first place. The government's claim transformed her financial life into a frantic, high-wire act. Every dollar she earned from her triumphant concert tours and film comebacks was immediately earmarked to appease the tax authorities. Instead of providing security, her success only increased the burden, as higher earnings meant larger tax liabilities. The IRS was not a forgiving creditor. They pursued her with a cold, bureaucratic relentlessness, placing liens on her earnings and seizing assets. There are heartbreaking stories of agents showing up backstage after a performance to collect a percentage of the night's ticket sales directly from the theater owner before Judy ever saw a cent. Imagine the humiliation and anxiety of this, giving your all to a cheering crowd, only to be met by a government agent with a hand out as you left the stage, a constant reminder that your labor was not truly your own. This relentless pursuit turned every contract, every performance, into a necessity for survival rather than an expression of art. She was trapped on a treadmill, working not for fame or fulfillment, but to stay one step ahead of a debt that seemed to grow faster than she could pay it down. The financial pressure corrupted every aspect of her life. It forced her to take on projects she might have otherwise avoided, to tour when she was physically and emotionally exhausted, and to make decisions based on desperation rather than desire. The very thing that was meant to be her salvation, her ability to work, had become a form of indentured servitude to the taxman, a cruel paradox where her greatest talent was the source of her deepest insecurity. And so the very tools she used to survive her craft began to wage a silent, brutal war against her body. The 1960s, a decade that should have been her triumphant reign as a conquering queen of stage and screen, instead became a deepening nightmare of dependency. The carefully managed cycle of uppers and downers instilled in her youth was no longer a controlled regimen. It had metastasized into a full-blown, chaotic addiction that governed her every waking moment. The pills were no longer just for work. They were for life. To get out of bed in a strange hotel room, to face the loneliness of another city, to silence the chorus of anxieties that haunted her. Each challenge demanded a chemical solution. Alcohol entered the mix, a desperate attempt to smooth the jagged edges of the pills, to calm the frenetic energy of the amphetamines, or to deepen the numbing escape of the sedatives. This dangerous cocktail created a toxic feedback loop inside her, a physiological civil war that left her nervous system in a state of constant alarm. The signs were becoming impossible to ignore for those who watched her perform. Her hands, once so expressive, would sometimes develop a noticeable tremor. There were concerts where her legendary memory for lyrics would falter, moments of disorientation flashing in her eyes before she willed herself back into the song. The vibrant energy that once seemed boundless could now swing violently between manic, almost frantic highs and periods of profound exhaustion, where she seemed to be clinging to the microphone stand for physical support. The immense effort it took to simply appear on stage was now Herculean, a battle fought not just with stage fright, but with the very chemistry of her own body. This escalating crisis triggered a series of desperate interventions, the first of many cycles of rehabilitation and heart-wrenching relapse that would define her final years. Well-meaning friends, family, and managers would stage confrontations, pleading with her to seek help. There were stays at exclusive clinics, moments of clarity where she would acknowledge the monster that had its claws in her and commit to getting well. These periods of detox were agonizing, forcing her body and mind to function without the substances they had relied on for decades. For a short time, she would emerge seemingly rejuvenated, her spirit bright and her determination fierce. She would speak openly about her struggles, vowing to audiences that she was back and better than ever. But the underlying causes of her addiction, the lifetime of trauma, the deeply ingrained insecurities, the financial pressures, and the sheer physical toll of withdrawal, were never fully addressed. The world she returned to was the same world that had created the problem. A new contract would appear, a tour would be booked, the pressure would mount, and the old coping mechanism, the only one she had ever truly known, would whisper its promises of instant relief. A relapse often began not with a wild binge, but with a single pill to get through a difficult day, a logical exception that quickly became the rule again. Each return to addiction was more devastating than the last, erasing the progress of rehab and plunging her into a deeper, darker pit of dependence. It was a cruel Sisyphean cycle. She would climb towards health, only to have the boulder of her addiction crash down upon her once more, each time leaving her a little more battered and a little less hopeful. The most public and painful evidence of this decline was the increasing inconsistency of her performances. The woman who had once been the most reliable blast of energy in show business was becoming a liability. Bookings were canceled with little notice, leaving promoters furious and fans disappointed. There were still nights of pure, incandescent magic where she would defy all odds and deliver a performance that left audiences weeping with joy. Proof that the genius within her was still fighting. But these glorious exceptions were now surrounded by shows that were ragged, disjointed, or tragically cut short. In London, a performance ended after just a few numbers when she became too disoriented to continue. In Melbourne, she was booed off the stage after a rambling, incoherent monologue. These incidents were not the actions of an unprofessional diva. They were the visible symptoms of a person losing a brutal fight for control over her own mind and body. The very thing that had defined her, her profound connection with her audience, was now being fractured by the very forces she could no longer command. The pills that had been given to her as a child to ensure the show would always go on were now ensuring that, with increasing frequency, the show could not go on at all. The tragedy was that she knew it. In her lucid moments, the shame and humiliation were crushing. The fear of failing her audience, the people whose love was her oxygen, became a self-fulfilling prophecy, feeding the anxiety that drove her back to the bottle and the pill bottle. It was a prison with no exit, a devastating descent where the need to perform fueled the addiction, and the addiction destroyed her ability to perform, trapping Judy Garland in a downward spiral from which there would be no final escape. The relentless cycle of addiction and the crushing weight of her circumstances created a despair so profound that Judy Garland began to see death as the only possible escape. The multiple suicide attempts that marked her adult life were not the dramatic gestures of a Hollywood diva, but desperate, agonizing acts of a soul in unimaginable pain, feeling utterly trapped with no way out. The first publicly known incident occurred in 1950, right as her world was collapsing with MGM. Overwhelmed by the humiliation of being fired and the terror of an uncertain future, she slashed her throat with a broken glass. It was a violent, desperate cry for help that shocked the industry. But it was tragically just the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself for nearly 2 decades. Each attempt coincided with a moment of extreme pressure or perceived failure. After the devastating Oscar loss for A Star is Born, she made another serious attempt, unable to bear the public rejection that felt like a confirmation of her deepest insecurities. The cancellation of her television show prompted another, as the failure represented not just a professional setback, but a personal indictment. And the constant grinding anxiety of her financial ruin, with the IRS perpetually at her door, pushed her to the brink on more than one occasion. To understand these acts, you have to look past the fame and the glamour and see a human being who felt she had exhausted every option. She was trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, where the very talent that was her salvation was also the source of her torment. The expectations were a suffocating weight. Audiences paid to see the vibrant, energetic Judy Garland, But the woman backstage was often a hollowed-out version of that icon, chemically dependent and emotionally shattered. The fear of not being able to deliver, of disappointing the very people whose love sustained her, became a self-fulfilling prophecy of anxiety. Her suicide attempts were the ultimate expression of this feeling of being a fraud, a commodity that had broken down and was no longer fit for purpose. They were acts of a person who believed in those darkest moments that the world would be better off without the burden of her continued failure. The tragedy is that each time she was revived, she was often met not with the compassionate, long-term psychological care she so desperately needed, but with a quick fix to get her back on her feet and back to work. The system, and even well-meaning people in her life, often failed to grasp the depth of her psychological trauma, treating the symptoms of her despair instead of its root causes. These were not attempts to end her life for fame. They were desperate bids to end a pain that had become unbearable, a final, heartbreaking effort to find a peace that fame and fortune could never provide. This desperate search for an anchor, for someone who could finally quiet the storm within, defined Judy Garland's personal life as intensely as her performances defined her public one. Her 5 marriages can be seen not as a series of discrete relationships, but as a single, continuous quest for the stability and salvation that had been denied to her since childhood. After the collapse of her marriages to David Rose, Vincent Minnelli, and others, each union began with a familiar, hopeful pattern, a passionate, whirlwind romance with a man who presented himself as her knight in shining armor, a strong figure who promised to take control of the chaos and finally make her feel safe. These men, from the composer Rose to the producer Sid Luft, often stepped into the role of manager as well as husband, creating a dangerous fusion of personal and professional life. For a woman who had never been taught to manage her own affairs, this seemed like a logical solution. She was handing the reins to someone she trusted, hoping they could navigate the complexities of fame and finance that so completely overwhelmed her. Yet, without fail, these saviors proved to be just as fallible and often as ill-equipped as she was to handle the immense pressures of her world. They became enmeshed in the very chaos they promised to resolve, struggling with her addictions, battling the relentless scrutiny of the press, and failing to protect her from the financial vultures that circled constantly. The dynamic was heartbreakingly predictable. The initial rescue would give way to resentment, the control would feel like confinement, and the relationship would end in acrimony and further emotional devastation, leaving Judy feeling more abandoned and hopeless than before. This pattern reached its final tragic conclusion with her 5th husband, a man named Mickey Deans. They met in the late 1960s, a period when Judy's life had become a vortex of professional cancellations, dire financial troubles, and increasingly public struggles with her health. Deans, a nightclub manager significantly younger than Judy, burst onto the scene with a kind of brash, youthful energy that must have felt like a lifeline. He presented himself as a man of the new generation, unburdened by the old Hollywood baggage that haunted her. He was charismatic, attentive, and he promised her a fresh start, a life away from the crushing demands of performance. For Judy, who was physically exhausted and emotionally bankrupt, this was an irresistible offer. Their courtship was swift, and they married in a quiet ceremony in London in March of 1969. To the outside world, and perhaps to Judy herself in her most hopeful moments, it looked like a final chance at happiness. Dean spoke grandly of managing her comeback, of securing a residency at a London nightclub called Talk of the Town that would offer her a dignified, sustainable career. He seemed to genuinely care for her, but the brutal truth was that he was utterly unprepared for the reality of her condition. He was a promoter, not a caretaker, and he had little understanding of the profound depth of her addiction and the psychological trauma that fueled it. The man who had promised to be her rock was quickly in over his head, watching helplessly as the woman he married continued to spiral, her body and mind failing under the weight of decades of abuse. The marriage to Mickey Deans lasted a mere 3 months, and it serves as the ultimate symbol of the futility of her search for external salvation. The grand plans for the London residency materialized, but the shows were a shadow of her former glory. She struggled to get through the performances, her voice sometimes a frail echo of what it once was, her legendary confidence replaced by a palpable vulnerability. Behind the scenes, Deans was unable to provide the structured, therapeutic environment she so desperately needed. Instead of a stabilizing force, he became another witness to her collapse. The fairy tale of rescue evaporated, leaving only the cold, hard reality of a terminally ill woman and a husband who could do nothing to save her. In the end, Mickey Deans was not the villain of the story. He was simply the last in a long line of men who believed that love and ambition could fix a problem that required intensive, professional medical and psychological intervention. He was the final figure in a lifelong pattern of seeking a protector, only to find that no single person could ever bear the weight of the damage inflicted by an entire system. Her marriages were not the cause of her tragedy. They were a symptom of it, repeated attempts to find the safety and unconditional acceptance that Hollywood had stolen from her when she was just a child, a search that ended as it began, in profound loneliness. And so, with her marriage to Mickey Deans promising a clean slate, Judy Garland made what would be her final, fateful move, crossing the Atlantic to London in early 1969. For a woman whose life had been a relentless series of comebacks, this was to be the ultimate revival, a complete geographical and symbolic break from the Hollywood that had both made and broken her. London represented a sophisticated, appreciative audience, far removed from the cutthroat industry pressures of Los Angeles. The engagement at the famed Talk of the Town nightclub was positioned as the cornerstone of this new beginning. It was not to be a grueling tour, but a stable 5-week residency, a chance for her to perform in an elegant, intimate setting without the exhausting travel. The promotional materials buzzed with optimism, billing it as the triumphant return of a living legend. Yet, from the very first night, a palpable sense of unease settled over the venue. The Judy Garland who walked onto the stage was a heartbreakingly diminished version of the electrifying force of nature audiences remembered. The voice, that instrument of unparalleled emotional power, was now fragile and frayed, its famous vibrato sometimes slipping into an uncontrollable wobble. There were moments of the old magic, a perfectly held note in Over the Rainbow that would bring a collective sigh from the crowd, a flash of the witty, self-deprecating banter that had always been her signature. But these were islands of brilliance in a sea of struggle. She seemed physically frail, her movements less certain, her legendary connection with the audience now intermittent, as if she were fighting a battle deep within herself just to remain present. Some nights, she would abruptly stop a song, claiming a forgotten lyric, and engage the audience in a rambling, disjointed monologue that felt less like charming spontaneity and more like a cry for help. The rigorous pacing of a full concert was now beyond her. Performances were often shortened, and the set list was pared down to the bare essentials. The audience, a mix of devoted fans and curious onlookers, reacted with a mixture of pity, discomfort, and a profound, aching sadness. They were not witnessing a triumphant comeback. They were witnessing a public unraveling. The very thing that had always defined her, an unbreakable will to deliver for her fans, was visibly failing. The talk of the town engagement, intended as a celebration, instead became a stark, real-time documentation of her decline. It was clear to everyone in the room that the star they had come to see was fighting a losing war against the accumulated toll of a lifetime, and the stage, once her sanctuary, had become the most public of battleground. The final weeks of Judy Garland's life unfolded in a rented townhouse at 4 Cadogan Lane in London, a setting that should have been a peaceful haven, but instead became the quiet, lonely stage for her last act. Her marriage to Mickey Deans, which had begun with such whirlwind hope just 3 months earlier, was already showing the strain of reality. The grand plans for a stable residency at the talk of the town had concluded, and the critical response had been a painful mix of nostalgia and pity, highlighting her frail voice and diminished presence. Rather than returning to the United States, Judy and Deans decided to stay on in London, perhaps hoping that distance from Hollywood would provide some solace, or maybe because there was simply nowhere else to go. Their life in the Chelsea neighborhood was a strange imitation of domesticity, a far cry from the glamour of her past. Friends who visited noted a profound exhaustion in her, a deep-seated weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. She spent much of her days in the house, chain smoking, watching television, and existing in a kind of listless limbo, while Deans attempted to secure new business ventures that always seemed just out of reach. The vibrant energy that had once powered her through countless performances was now entirely depleted, leaving behind a woman who seemed both physically and spiritually hollowed out. The telephone became a source of both connection and anxiety. She would have long, rambling, often late-night calls with friends and her children back in the States, her voice fluctuating between moments of lucid warmth and periods of confused despair. In these conversations, she would talk about future projects, a television series, another album, but the plans lacked the fiery conviction of old. They were the ghostly echoes of a dream she no longer had the strength to pursue. The specifics of those final days form a heartbreakingly mundane timeline, the ordinary details of life standing in stark contrast to the extraordinary tragedy they were leading toward. On Friday, June 20th, Judy ventured out with Mickey Deans to see a film, a rare departure from the confines of the townhouse. They chose a movie that perhaps offered a strange, painful resonance with her own life, a film about the rise and fall of a musical star. Afterward, they had dinner at a small Italian restaurant near their home, a simple, quiet evening that, for a fleeting moment, might have felt normal. But the facade was fragile. The following day, Saturday the 21st, was largely spent at home. Judy was described as being in low spirits, weighed down by a profound sense of inertia. That evening, around 7:30, she spoke on the phone with her ex-husband and longtime manager, Sid Luft, the father of her children, Lorna and Joey. The conversation was reportedly tense, centering on financial matters, the never-ending source of her dread, the crushing burden of debt, the relentless pursuit by the tax authorities, was a constant shadow over any moment of peace. After the call, she and Deans had a quiet dinner at home. Later that night, she spoke with her daughter Liza, who was in Paris. The conversation was said to be affectionate, a mother's love transcending the miles, but it would also be their last. As the night wore on, Judy could not sleep. The insomnia that had plagued her since her teenage years, first chemically induced by the studio and now a permanent feature of her existence, held her in its grip. In the early hours of Sunday, June 22nd, around 2 a.m, she was still awake. Mickey Deans, finding her restless, went out to a nearby all-night pharmacy to try to get a prescription for a sedative to help her rest. When he returned to the house around 3 a.m, he found Judy in their bedroom, still awake, but seemingly settled. He gave her the medication, and they both finally went to sleep. It was a quiet, ordinary end to a day, the kind of small, hopeful gesture for rest that had defined her life for decades. The next morning, Sunday, June 22nd, Mickey Deans woke around 11. Noting that Judy was still asleep, he left her to rest, assuming she was finally getting the deep sleep that had eluded her for so long. He went about his morning, making phone calls and attending to small tasks around the house. As noon approached and there was still no movement from the bedroom, a flicker of concern began to grow. He went to check on her and found her in bed, but she was not merely asleep. He attempted to rouse her, but she was unresponsive. In a panic, he telephoned their doctor, who arrived swiftly at the house. There was nothing to be done. Judy Garland was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death would later be determined to be an accidental overdose of barbiturates, a grim and tragic full circle that led back to the very same kind of sedatives first given to her by the MGM studio doctor when she was just a child. The specific drug was Seconal, a powerful barbiturate that, when combined with the other medications in her system and the extreme wear and tear on her body after a lifetime of struggle, had simply caused her system to shut down. It was not a deliberate act of suicide, but the final, catastrophic failure of a body and a spirit that had been pushed beyond all human endurance. The little girl who had sung about a land where troubles melted like lemon drops had, at the age of 47, finally found her rest, but it was a rest born of exhaustion in a system that had consumed her from the inside out. The news of her death sent shockwaves around the world, not just as the passing of a celebrity, but as the extinguishing of a brilliant, fragile light that had illuminated the lives of millions, a tragic final curtain on a life that was equal parts magic and sorrow. The official inquest into Judy Garland's death, held just a few days later, delivered a verdict that was both clinical and heartbreakingly symbolic. The coroner ruled the cause of death as an incautious self-overdose of barbiturates. That specific phrase, incautious self-overdose, is crucial to understanding the final, tragic ambiguity of her passing. It was not officially deemed a suicide, a deliberate act to end her life. Instead, it was classified as an accident, a fatal miscalculation by someone whose entire adult life had been a precarious balancing act with powerful prescription drugs. The primary culprit was identified as Seconal, a potent sedative belonging to the barbiturate family, the very same class of drugs that had been doled out to her by studio doctors decades earlier to counteract the amphetamines and force her body to sleep. In the end, the tool used to manage the artificial life imposed upon her became the instrument of its conclusion. The coroner's report detailed that the level of the drug in her bloodstream was not necessarily indicative of a single massive ingestion meant to be fatal. Rather, it suggested a scenario that was tragically familiar to those who knew her struggle. A body so weakened and a system so fundamentally compromised by decades of substance abuse that it could no longer process what had once been a standard, if dangerous, dosage. Her liver, heart, and other vital organs had been under siege for years, eroded by the constant chemical warfare waged within her. What might have been a survivable amount for a healthy person became a lethal dose for Judy Garland, because the very foundation of her health had been hollowed out. This was the hidden toll finally coming due. The incaution cited by the coroner was not mere carelessness. It was the end result of a normalized relationship with medication forced upon her as a child. When your entire existence has been medically managed by authorities you are taught to trust, the line between a prescribed dose and a dangerous one becomes blurred. For Judy, taking a pill to sleep was as routine as brushing her teeth, a habit ingrained over 30 years. The tragedy of the incautious self-overdose verdict is that it absolves any single individual of direct blame while simultaneously implicating the entire system that created the conditions for such an accident to be inevitable. It was the final quiet footnote to a life lived in a chemical straitjacket, a death caused not by a single night's mistake, but by a lifetime of being taught that her own natural rhythms were insufficient, and that chemical intervention was the only path to meeting the world's impossible demand. The news of Judy Garland's death traveled across the globe with a stunning, somber finality, but the true measure of her impact was revealed not in the headlines, but in the collective grief that poured forth from the millions who felt they had lost a part of themselves. Her body was flown back to New York City, the site of her greatest triumph at Carnegie Hall, for a funeral that was less a celebrity event and more a profound public ritual of mourning. On the morning of June 27, 1969, thousands of ordinary people began gathering outside the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel on Manhattan's Upper East Side. They were not paparazzi or curiosity seekers. They were her fans, a sea of faces representing every walk of life, who stood for hours in the humid summer air, waiting patiently for a chance to file past her coffin and say a final goodbye. The line stretched for blocks, a silent, moving testament to the intimate connection she had forged with each of them through her music and her struggles. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of Hollywood grandeur and raw human sorrow. The room was filled with the most famous faces of the era, colleagues like Katharine Hepburn, Mickey-Rooney, and Lauren Bacall, all of whom had witnessed the arc of her career from its dazzling beginning to its tragic end. But amidst the glamour, the most powerful presence was that of her family, especially her daughter, Liza Minnelli. At just 23 years old, Liza, herself already a rising star, embodied a heartbreaking duality. She was both a grieving daughter and a symbol of the legacy her mother left behind. Photographs from that day capture her leaning over her mother's open casket, her face a mask of sheer, unvarnished agony. A moment so private and painful, it became one of the iconic images of 20th century mourning. It was a glimpse of the real woman behind the legend, not Judy Garland, the icon, but Frances Gumm, the mother, and the profound human loss her children were enduring. The service itself was simple and poignant, reflecting Judy's own tumultuous relationship with faith and her search for peace. The eulogy was delivered by the actor James Mason, her co-star from A Star is Born, a film whose plot now seemed tragically prophetic. He spoke not of a distant, untouchable star, but of a vulnerable, warm, and incredibly funny woman. His most memorable line captured the essence of the tragedy perfectly, stating that Judy Garland was, quote, the symbol of the fact that talent is not enough. He elaborated that her life was a testament to the idea that an artist needs more than genius. They need protection, understanding, and a world that does not exploit their gift to the point of destruction. It was a quiet yet damning indictment of the very system that had nurtured and then devoured her. As her coffin was carried out of the chapel, the crowd outside, which had remained so respectfully quiet, broke into spontaneous applause. It was not a celebration, but a final, thunderous ovation, a last bravo for the decades of joy and heartbreak she had given them. This public mourning was about more than the loss of a talented entertainer. It was a collective recognition of a shared story. For her fans, Judy's struggles were not tabloid fodder. They were a mirror of their own insecurities and battles. They saw in her a person who felt things too deeply, who fought against her demons in public, and who, despite it all, kept getting up to sing again. Her death felt like the loss of innocence itself, a final confirmation that the bright, hopeful world of Oz was indeed a fantasy, and that the real world could be a cruel and unforgiving place for its most sensitive souls. The world wasn't just mourning a star. It was mourning the beautiful, broken promise of what she could have been in a kinder world, a symbol of exploited talent whose light had been extinguished long before its time. But the tragedy of Judy Garland did not conclude with her final breath in that London townhouse. In many ways, her death merely opened a new, deeply contentious chapter, one fought not on the stage or the soundstage, but in the cold, impersonal arena of the courtroom. The chaos that had defined her life seemed to instantly transfer itself into a bitter battle over her legacy and, most heartbreakingly, over the futures of her two youngest children. At the time of her passing, Lorna was 16 and Joey was just 12, and they were left in a state of profound vulnerability, not only emotionally devastated by the loss of their mother, but also physically and financially adrift in England with their stepfather, Mickey Deans. The immediate question of who would have legal custody of the children ignited a firestorm. Deans, as Judy's husband of only 3 months, assumed a certain authority, but he was a figure with little established history in their lives and was grappling with his own shock and the collapse of his brief marriage. The situation triggered an immediate and desperate transatlantic phone call from Deans to Judy's third ex-husband, Sid Luft, the father of Lorna and Joey. Luft, who had been a constant, if often combative, presence in their lives as both a parent and their mother's former manager, was in Los Angeles. Upon hearing the news, he did not hesitate. His paternal instinct was to get to his children as quickly as possible. The subsequent race to London became a dramatic prelude to the legal war to come, with Luft navigating a whirlwind of grief and logistical nightmares to secure their return to the United States. This initial scramble for the children was a stark preview of the prolonged and public custody battle that would soon dominate the headlines, a painful spectacle that forced two grieving youngsters into the center of a dispute between the man who was their biological father and the man who had been their mother's final husband. The legal fight over the estate itself was a labyrinthine mess that perfectly reflected the financial disarray of Judy's life. The first and most crushing revelation was the staggering depth of her debts. Despite a career that generated an estimated $20 to $30 million in earnings, a colossal sum for the era, Judy Garland died with assets valued at only around $1.3 million, a figure that was utterly dwarfed by her liabilities. The most formidable creditor was, as it had been for years, the Internal Revenue Service, which claimed she owed nearly $4 million in back taxes and penalties. This meant the estate was insolvent from the outset. There was simply not enough money to cover the massive debts, let alone provide a substantial inheritance for her children. The battle then shifted to the control of the estate's few remaining valuable assets, primarily the future earnings from her name, image, and recorded works, her intellectual property. Mickey Deans, as the surviving spouse, initially claimed the right to administer the estate, but his position was immediately challenged by Sid Luft, who argued that Deans was unfit and had been a fleeting, destabilizing influence. The courts were left to untangle a web of conflicting claims, past contracts, and allegations of financial mismanagement. This legal morass meant that instead of her legacy being carefully managed to provide for her children's future, it became a source of income for lawyers and a prize to be fought over by various claimants for years. The very essence of Judy Garland, her songs, her films, her iconic status was reduced to a financial asset in a bankruptcy proceeding, a bitterly ironic fate for an artist whose work was so deeply connected to human emotion and vulnerability. The promise of ongoing royalties from albums like the monumental Judy at Carnegie Hall, which should have been a financial bedrock for her family, was instead funneled toward paying down the endless debt to the government and other creditors, a process that would take decades to resolve. The most prolonged and personally devastating conflict was the custody war over Lorna and Joey Luft. Sid Luft, after bringing them back to California, filed for formal custody, positioning himself as the stable, biological parent ready to provide a home. Mickey Deans contested this, arguing that Judy would have wanted him to care for the children. The subsequent court hearings were a painful public airing of Judy's final, chaotic years, with each side presenting evidence aimed at discrediting the other. Deans's brief marriage and his limited relationship with the children were scrutinized, while Luft's own past, including his sometimes turbulent history with Judy and his financial struggles, was put under a microscope. For Lorna and Joey, who had just lost their mother in the most traumatic of circumstances, this public battle between their father and stepfather was a fresh ordeal, forcing them to navigate a profound grief under the watchful eye of the law and the press. The court's ultimate decision to grant sole custody to Sid Luft brought a measure of stability, but it could not erase the scars of the experience. The litigation over Judy Garland's estate and her children stands as a final, heartbreaking coda to her story. It demonstrated with brutal clarity how the financial and personal instability that plagued her life had a lasting, destructive power that reached beyond her death. Even in rest, she was not granted peace. Her legacy became a subject of dispute, and her most precious responsibility, her children, became pawns in a legal struggle. It was the ultimate proof that the Hollywood system which created her had left behind a wreckage so complete that it took years of courtroom battles just to begin the process of sorting through the pieces. Yet even as her physical presence faded, Judy Garland's spirit found an enduring and powerful home within a community that saw in her not just a star, but a soulmate. Her profound and enduring connection with the LGBTQ+ community is a vital chapter of her legacy, one that transformed her personal struggles into a universal anthem of survival. This was not a calculated marketing strategy or a deliberate effort on her part. It was an organic, deeply felt identification that grew from the shared experience of being an outsider. For gay men and women living in an era of intense societal repression, from the 1940s through the 60s and beyond, Judy's life and art provided a resonant mirror. They saw in her a fellow traveler who understood what it meant to perform for survival, to put on a brave face and a dazzling smile for a world that might not accept your true self. Her entire career, in a sense, was a masterclass in this very act. She was the ultimate performer, expected to project a manufactured image of wholesome, girl next door innocence, while internally grappling with immense pain, addiction, and a feeling of never quite measuring up. This duality, the glittering exterior masking a vulnerable interior, was a daily reality for countless LGBTQ+ individuals who had to create a public persona to navigate a hostile world. Judy's very existence became a testament to the art of the facade, but it was the cracks in that facade that made her truly beloved. Her public struggles were not seen as failures. They were proof of her humanity. When she was late to a concert, or her voice wavered, or she openly wept on stage, it wasn't interpreted as unprofessionalism by her gay fans. It was seen as a moment of radical honesty, a brief lowering of the mask that revealed the authentic, suffering person beneath the sequins. In those moments, she wasn't Judy Garland, the icon. She was Frances Gumm, fighting to get through the day, and in that vulnerability, she became a symbol of incredible resilience. The soundtrack to this shared experience was, of course, her music. And no song encapsulates this connection more powerfully than Over the Rainbow. While for the general public, it was a beautiful ballad about a child's wish, for the gay community, it took on a far deeper, more urgent meaning. The lyrics became a coded anthem for a different kind of longings, yearning for a world beyond the confines of a prejudiced society, a place where one could live openly and without fear. The somewhere over the rainbow was not a geographical location. It was a state of being, a promised land of acceptance and safety that felt just as distant and magical as the land of Oz. The song's yearning plea, "Why, oh, why can't I?" echoed the internal cry of every person who felt forced to hide their true identity. This interpretation was cemented by the very culture of the time. In the decades before the Stonewall riots, gay bars were often clandestine, underground spaces, the real-world equivalent of Dorothy's cyclone, whisking people away from the black and white Kansas of their daily lives into a vibrant, colorful, but hidden community. In these safe havens, Judy's records were cherished. Her voice, with its unique blend of strength and fragility, became the sound of solidarity and hope. Her ability to belt a song with defiant power, then moments later deliver a lyric with heartbreaking tenderness, mirrored the emotional roller coaster of closeted life, the moments of joyous release alongside the pangs of loneliness and isolation. She sang about longing for a love that society told you was wrong, about putting on a happy face when you felt like you were breaking inside, and about the sheer determination to survive against all odds. Every time she stepped onto a stage, battling her demons to deliver a transcendent performance, she was living out a narrative of triumph over adversity that resonated profoundly with a community fighting for its own right to exist. This bond was strengthened by the unique nature of her live performances, which evolved into something akin to secular religious ceremonies for her fans. Attending a Judy Garland concert was not a passive experience. It was a collective, emotional event. Her audience, filled with a significant number of gay men, didn't just watch her, they participated. They knew every lyric, every vocal inflection, every gesture. They would cheer her entrances with an almost evangelical fervor, shout words of encouragement during songs, and greet her moments of vulnerability with waves of empathetic support. This created a powerful feedback loop. Judy, who craved and fed off adoration, felt truly seen and unconditionally loved by this audience in a way she never had by studio executives. In return, she gave them everything she had. The concert hall became a sacred space where outsiderhood was not a weakness, but a badge of honor, and where the shared experience of pain was transformed through her voice into something beautiful and empowering. This relationship was perhaps most tangibly expressed through a piece of cultural slang that originated in the gay community and endures to this day: friend of Dorothy. In the mid-20th century, this phrase was a discreet way for gay men to identify themselves to one another without risking exposure. To be a friend of Dorothy was to be part of a secret tribe, bound by a shared understanding and a shared idol. It was a brilliant piece of coding, using the innocent image of Dorothy Gale from The Wizard of Oz to signal a forbidden identity. The term provided a layer of safety and belonging, and its connection to Judy Garland cemented her status as more than an entertainer. She was a patron saint, a symbol around which a community could quietly coalesce. Her tragic death in 1969, coming just days before the Stonewall riots erupted in New York City, felt like a cosmic passing of the torch. The grief felt by the gay community was immense, but the defiance and resilience she had embodied for decades helped fuel the new militancy of the gay liberation movement. The woman who had taught them how to survive with grace under pressure now inspired them to fight back. Judy Garland's legacy as a gay icon is therefore not a footnote in her story. It is central to understanding her cultural impact. She became an accidental pioneer, a figure whose art and life gave voice to the voiceless and provided a beacon of hope for millions who saw in her struggles a reflection of their own, and in her enduring spirit, a reason to keep believing in a world over the rainbow. The shadow cast by Judy Garland was not one that simply faded with her passing. It stretched long and deep, falling most heavily upon the 3 children she left behind. For Liza, Lorna, and Joey, their mother was not just a parent, but a global phenomenon. And inheriting that legacy was a burden of impossible weight, intertwined with a love as vast as her talent. They grew up in a world where normalcy was a foreign concept. Their childhood home a revolving door of fame, crisis, and the relentless glare of the public eye. They witnessed firsthand the brutal cost of stardom, the chemical crutches, the desperate attempts to find stability, and the profound loneliness that could exist at the center of a crowd. This was not a life observed from a distance. It was the air they breathed, the unpredictable rhythm of their daily existence. Their mother's love was fierce and undeniable, but it was often delivered from a place of profound instability, leaving them in the precarious position of sometimes being the caregivers rather than the cared for. Young Liza, in particular, learned to read the subtle signs of her mother's distress, a skill no child should have to master. This unique upbringing forged a powerful bond between the siblings, a shared understanding of a singular, chaotic experience, but it also programmed them for a life where the boundary between personal struggle and public spectacle was perpetually blurred. For Liza Minnelli, the burden of legacy was both a launching pad and an inescapable cage. She possessed her own formidable, explosive talent, a force of nature that was undeniable from her earliest years. But from the moment she stepped into the spotlight, she was not just Liza. She was Judy Garland's daughter. Every note she sang, every role she took, was measured against the ghost of her mother's iconic voice. The comparisons were constant and unforgiving. Was she as vulnerable? Did she have the same emotional depth? Could she ever truly escape the long shadow of Dorothy Gale? This pressure was immense, a psychological tightrope she had to walk throughout her entire career. Yet, Liza did not try to be a replica. Instead, she channeled the same raw, electric energy, but funneled it into a different persona, one of brassy, defiant survivorship. Where Judy's vulnerability often seemed to tremble on the edge of collapse, Liza's performances projected a gritty, street-smart resilience. Her triumph in the film Cabaret, for which she won an Academy Award, was a masterful declaration of individuality. Her portrayal of Sally Bowles was the antithesis of a Garland character. It was cynical, world-weary, and fiercely independent. Winning the Oscar was a monumental achievement, a moment that should have been solely hers. Yet, the specter of her mother's infamous snub for a star is born hung over the victory, adding a layer of poetic, bittersweet justice that the public and press could not resist highlighting. Even in her greatest moment of personal triumph, her narrative was inextricably linked to her mother's tragedy. Lorna and Joey Luft, while choosing paths less directly in the blinding glare of the spotlight, faced their own unique challenges. Growing up in the tumultuous final years of their mother's life, they experienced the most extreme version of her decline. The stability that Liza might have glimpsed in earlier years was gone, replaced by the frantic, unpredictable chaos of Judy's later career and the constant threat of financial ruin. After their mother's death, the very public and bitter custody battle between their father, Sid Luft, and their stepfather, Mickey Deans, thrust them into a fresh ordeal, their grief becoming a subject of legal dispute and media fascination. Like their sister, they too battled the demons of addiction, a painful testament to the genetic and environmental hand they were dealt. Lorna pursued a career in singing and performing, inevitably facing the daughter of label at every turn, but she often spoke with a remarkable clarity about the complexities of her upbringing, acknowledging the pain while fiercely protecting her mother's memory. Joey, largely staying out of the entertainment industry, nonetheless carried the weight of his mother's story, his life a more private testament to the aftermath of such a profound loss. For all three children, the question was never just about forging their own identities, but about navigating a world that saw them first as fragments of a broken myth. They became custodians of a legacy they did not choose, forced to reconcile the private woman they loved with the public icon the world mourned, all while fighting their own battles in a landscape their mother's life had defined. The Garland tragedy did not end in a London townhouse. It echoed through the generations, a poignant reminder that the price of fame is often paid not just by the star, but by the hearts they leave behind. Looking at the glittering landscape of modern entertainment, it's tempting to believe that the kind of systematic destruction Judy Garland endured is a relic of a brutal, bygone era. Certainly, the iron-fisted control of the old studio system has been dismantled. Actors are no longer bound by 7-year contracts that grant a corporation ownership over their personal lives. But to assume the industry has fully learned its lesson is to misunderstand how the pressures have simply evolved, transforming from a single, powerful oppressor into a diffuse, omnipresent force of scrutiny. The gilded cage of Metro-Goldwyn Mayer has been replaced by the panopticon of social media, where the judgment is no longer delivered by a single executive behind a mahogany desk, but by millions of strangers armed with smartphones. The pressure to be perfect, to be marketable, and to be relentlessly available is, in many ways, more intense and inescapable than ever before. A bad review in a newspaper could be forgotten by tomorrow, but a viral clip of a flawed performance or an ill-advised tweet can haunt a career indefinitely, preserved forever in the digital archives of the internet. The expectation for a young star today is not just to act or sing, but to be a brand manager, a content creator, and a public personality 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Where Judy's image was crafted and controlled by a dedicated publicity department, today's celebrities are often their own publicists, navigating a minefield of public opinion without a map. There is, however, a crucial and hopeful distinction: the language of mental health. In Judy Garland's time, her anxiety, depression, and addiction were framed as moral failings, a lack of professionalism, or simply the temperament of a difficult star. Today, we have the vocabulary to name these struggles. It is now standard practice for film and television sets to have therapists and wellness coordinators on hand. Open discussions about anxiety, burnout, and the need for breaks are becoming increasingly common, destigmatizing the very human responses to an inhuman level of pressure. A young actor today can, in theory, cite mental health as a reason to pause a project without instantly being blacklisted. This represents a monumental shift in awareness, a direct result of the tragedies of figures like Garland that force the industry to confront the consequences of its demand. Yet, awareness and substantive change are not the same thing. While the system may now acknowledge the problem, the underlying economic engine that drives the entertainment industry still prioritizes output over well-being. The relentless pace of content creation for streaming services, the constant demand for engagement on social media to maintain relevance, and the intense competition for a dwindling number of coveted roles create an environment where taking a step back can still be perceived as career suicide. The pills may not be handed out by a studio doctor anymore, but the pressure to perform can still lead performers towards self-medication, now facilitated by a different kind of underground economy. So, could a tragedy on the scale of Judy Garland's happen today? The answer is complex. It would likely look different. Instead of a single corporation methodically breaking down a star, we might see a talented individual slowly eroded by the cumulative effect of online hate, the impossibility of achieving digital perfection, and the relentless churn of the content machine. The abuse would be decentralized, making it harder to point a finger at a single villain, but the psychological toll could be just as devastating. The true legacy of Judy Garland's story, then, is not a simple assurance that things are better. It is a permanent cautionary tale, a mirror held up to the entertainment world in every generation. It asks us to look past the glamour and ask what we, as the audience, are demanding from the people who entertain us. It challenges the industry to ensure that its newfound language of mental wellness is backed up by genuine structural change, protecting the vulnerable, brilliant spirits who give us magic, ensuring that the price of that magic is no longer a human soul. Her story remains a haunting question mark over fame itself, a reminder that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows, and that the demand for endless brilliance can, if we are not vigilant, still extinguish the very flame we seek to celebrate. And so, the final curtain fell not on a quiet, peaceful resolution, but on a tragedy of epic proportions, a stark illustration of the immense chasm between a public image and a private reality. Judy Garland's life was a breathtaking arc that soared to the highest peaks of fame and plunged into the deepest valleys of despair. A journey that holds a dark mirror up to our own fascination with celebrity. To see her story as merely one of personal weakness or individual demons is to miss the profound systemic forces at work. It was a meticulously engineered downfall, beginning the very moment a 13-year-old girl was signed to a contract that valued her voice more than her well-being. The industry that promised to make her a star was the same industry that handed her the pills, orchestrated her insecurities, and discarded her when the machinery began to falter. She was, in the most literal sense, consumed by the very dream she was hired to sell. Her legacy, therefore, is a dual one. On one hand, she left behind an unparalleled artistic treasure trove, a voice that could convey the entire spectrum of human emotion, from the most fragile hope to the most defiant strength. Every time we hear "Over the Rainbow," we are witnessing a piece of that immortal magic. Yet, her equally powerful legacy is that of a cautionary tale, a permanent reminder of the human cost behind the glittering facade of entertainment. It challenges us to look beyond the glamorous surface and consider the immense pressures we place on those we elevate to icon status. The relentless demand for perfection, the constant scrutiny of appearance, and the expectation of superhuman resilience are burdens that have broken many, long after the studio system itself crumbled. Ultimately, the story of Judy Garland is a call for empathy, a plea to remember that behind every famous name, every hit song, and every iconic film role, there is a human being with fears, frailties, and a fundamental need for compassion. Her tragedy was not that she was weak, but that she possessed a sensitivity and a talent so brilliant that the world, in its insatiable desire to possess that light, had no idea how to protect it. She gave us everything: her joy, her tears, her very soul. The least we can do in return is to learn from her story, to see the person behind the persona, and to ensure that the price of fame never again becomes a human life. Let us remember her not just for the star that burned so brightly, but for the little girl from Grand Rapids who just wanted to sing, and who deserved so much more than the world ever gave her.